Yeah, it's interesting. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out in this our next in this series of our Discipleship Wednesdays. Tonight we have Caleb Haynes with us. Caleb and his wife Emily both planted and are co-lead pastors at Nashville Kaleo Church of the Nazarene. Caleb has gone to both Trevecca, and he also got studied theology and ecology at Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, UK. And Caleb and Emily have two beautiful girls. Now, Caleb has advocated for the increased care of creation and just the way that we respond as individuals to environmental justice, especially. He has co-vocationally operated earth tone reconstruction recycling since 2013. Is that right? Okay, yeah. And trying to reduce waste from landfills and recycling by repurposing and reclaiming items for creative use. In 2019, he co-founded Nazarenes for Creation Care, which is a grassroots organization designed to equip the church for engaging in our call to serve and keep creation. And he's also organized a Creation Care Summit, and he's a professional partner with the Evangelical Environmental Network, serves on the board at Creation Justice Ministries, and is host of the Eco-Christian podcast. So obviously a lot of stuff there, but he's also written the book Garbage Theology, which is, I just love that title. And just like with the others, there will be a giveaway of this tonight. So somebody can win a copy, and obviously you can also purchase copies at the back. Caleb's going to have a lot of different materials back there, co-authored a study with the Foundry on creation care. So what I wanted to open up with first is to ask you a little bit about why creation care and why that should be important to us in the church, especially the Church of the Nazarene.
Yeah, right on. Well, so glad to hang out with you guys tonight. I love you guys' space, and it's just a great area out here in Hendersonville. So don't get to come out here much. So why it's important for the Church of the Nazarene to talk about creation care specifically? Yeah, I think I love talking specifically about the intersection of creation care and the Church of the Nazarene, obviously, but I think that our theology already has so much good meat on the bone, I'm going to say, in the way of the work of creation care. As a holiness people, John Wesley and a lot of our theologians talk around creation care a lot and our relationship with the earth. And but even more than that, it's, sometimes I like to say it's just it's page one of the Bible stuff. That oftentimes we might talk about when we're kids with a felt board or something, but we don't really get back to it as an adult with more of a grown-up sense of what's going on here contextually in the scriptures, throughout the scripture. Creation care and our relationship with the earth is a thread that moves all the way throughout. But yeah, we just don't talk about it enough, honestly, and that's one thing that I'm trying to bring more into the middle of the room for us as a denomination. So,
and there are at least two places in our manual that we call people to take care of creation, both in the Covenant of Christian Conduct, which contains a lot of stuff, and in the appendixes. So it is important to us as a denomination, just like several other things that we believe is important, caring for the poor and others as well. Something you say in the book, which kind of stuck out here at the beginning, where you talk about education teaching you many things, but you say pastoring a church teaches you an entirely new set of things as education, which those of us that have been pastors know. Obviously, you've been a lead pastor for a while now. And you said, as it happens, picking up trash for years on end becomes yet another teacher. So tell us a little bit about what being, as you describe yourself as a garbage man in the book. Obviously a little more than that, but I think that kind of gives the idea of what's going on. But what has that taught you in terms of the things that we should be looking out for, especially if we're concerned about caring for creation?
Yeah, I don't think any of us would be surprised unfortunately, at a lot of the information and stats around waste and garbage in our American context, right? You've probably seen any number of headlines or seen locally the impact of an excessive amount of waste on your community or on the side of the streets or landfills. Even in Nashville right now, there's kind of like, okay, this landfill it's going to be capped soon. So what are we doing? And so we think about garbage in a way that we wheel our cans out to the street, maybe depending on where you live. And early in the morning, maybe before you've even had your first cup of coffee, the trash fairies have come and taken your garbage to Never Never Land, of which it will never be seen again, right? But the truth is, there's no such thing as throwing something away, right? I mean, we're only relocating these things. And so none of these things that are trash ever leave. And so what's happened now is we've created some significant environmental problems with the way that we've overconsumed on one hand, and then in turn created this world of waste that's just that takes the shape of so many different things, and infiltrates our soil and our water and our air in just great significant ways. And these aren't things that are separate from you and I, right? That all of this waste affects our health and our lives and the life of our children. And so that's what it comes back around to, right? There's no such thing as exploiting the earth and trashing and all this other these negative things, right? In loving our neighbor, we can't behave this way on the earth over here and then come over here and say we also love our neighbor, because this is one and the same, because we're part of this one planet, this one greater ecosystem, And I like to say we don't happen to be on Earth. God designed us for Earth, and there's so much beauty to think about there. But I really think that waste is a helpful framework for us to talk about creation care, because at the end of the day, nobody likes waste, right? You don't want to waste your time, you don't want to waste your money, you don't want to waste anything. But on the flip side, when you're having a day that feels super efficient, or it just seems like everything's jiving, right? You're not wasting anything. You're like, man, you're feeling really good, because I think there's a thumbprint there from our Creator that says we're created for a wasteless existence. So I realize how long I'm taking to answer this question right now. If you think about creation, right? The way creation works, the natural world, is that when one thing dies, it becomes food for the next thing. You can think about that with a tree and a leaf that falls to the ground, and it dissolves in the soil, becomes nitrogen, feeds the soil, new things grow. The deer comes, eats the thing that's growing. It's the Lion King principle. It's the circle of life, right? And it's beautiful. And it makes me think of a recycling symbol, if you've ever seen a recycling symbol, right? That turn, those three arrows that make a triangle. And a recycling symbol is one of the only symbols you can go anywhere in the world and someone will know what it means, right? And see it all over the world. And we just know what it means. And so, again, I like to think this is how God designed creation, to just be this wasteless place. Anyway, and so we could dig into that more, but we live in a time basically where we've exited out of that circular economy that God created creation in, and so Now everything's actually not feeding everything else, and so quite the opposite. Because everything's not feeding everything else, because we're not in right relatedness with creation, there are lots of really negative consequences to that. Anyway, yeah.
I think if you live in Hendersonville, you know that there are struggles with trash. That's one of the most favorite things that comes up on the hip Hendersonville sites, especially because we've changed the way the services work, and part of it is because we're generating more. And then it makes it harder for us to interact because, there's an expense to it. So it's not just the waste, but it's also the expense that it costs to move it, to do things with it, and just the space of where these go. I think, and you talk a bit about it in the book, but part of what I think drives us, and it's the kind of thing that we all can get fixated with, is the next shiny thing. The new iPhone comes out. Even though I've got the one that's 6 months old, I want the newest iPhone, right? That's what happens. We see the thing. But there's even some ideas, and this was famous in the 50s because the cars changed every year, the obsolescence, kind of a created obsolescence. But now we're getting into an area where even some of the goods that we buy are kind of created in a way, built or manufactured to kind of fail, so that we have to buy more of that eventually. And if you've had to buy an appliance, you mentioned this especially in the last 10 years, they're a lot different in terms of how long they can last than, say, 20 years ago or even longer. I mean, when Christy and I got married, we had a refrigerator that was from when I was a child, so it's from the 70s. And that thing ran until it finally, when we were moving from a duplex into a house, we saw this burn spot under it and realized that it was probably time to get rid of it. But since then, we've had, 4 or 5 refrigerators in the 28 years we've been married. So I'd say it's, there are those kind of things that we're impacted by because others are making decisions to try to drive, I would say, consumerism and consumption. And so how does that side of it, where there is a pressure, either forced by just manufacturing ideas or marketing to try to get us to go to the next big thing, to where what we have seems like it should be waste?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me know when you have all the answers to that. Yeah. I mean, you're naming that really well. There is, I'm trying to think of the name of it. Oh, it'll come to me. It's called The Story of Stuff. It's a really great little YouTube video that explains a lot of what you're talking about right now that you can look up, Story of Stuff. But I think we're all familiar with that, right? We've all got a toaster sitting in our closet somewhere at home right now, whatever appliance that is, or whatever that thing that is that we bought not 2 years ago that is not working, but we're not going to throw it away yet because doggone it, we're just frustrated by it. I have a very expensive, like, double door mini fridge sitting on my back deck right now that was in our Airbnb. And, I've still got the paperwork on it. There's not a scratch on it, but it just stopped working. And I've replaced a part. I'm calling around, it's like, what is this? Why is this? And, some call it designed for the dump, and some call it planned obsolescence, right? It's maybe the more official term. And you kind of alluded to that it's kind of happening. Well, I would say it's not kind of happening. It is happening. And it's very sinister. But companies realize that they're not going to make as much money when their things last a long time. And so that's why that certain appliance, or even a sweater, I mean, it could be anything. I've seen shoes fall apart, I mean, I think about how long I had a pair of tennis shoes as a kid and how long my kids have their shoes. And it's like my daughter finally bought a pair of Chuck Taylors, and she, I think they lasted like 4 months, and they were falling apart. And I pulled out mine that I have from high school, and you're like, well, something's different. And that's not right, is it? And so there's this design for the dump kind of quality that I think, that it definitely exists in the world. And places like France have already they've already passed legislation against this kind of thing. And now I think California, maybe some other states, are also passing legislation. And you can go to, I think it's righttorepair.org, and you can add your name and say, we want legislation on this to say that these companies should be held liable to this sort of thing. And if something breaks, then they should give us a pathway to repair, right? And so these are important things, I think, as the people of God, to say, look, this matters. This is not something that is detached from our faith, but it is something about when we believe we are created in the image of the Creator, to be co-creators with God, to caretake. John Wesley would say that we're stewards of all of this, right? None of this is ours. We don't get to keep it when we leave this place. We're temporarily stewards of this, right? Jesus talks about this over and over again in his in Matthew 24 and 25, right? When he's talking about when the only things Jesus gives us on the end times is that is these parables about being good stewards, right? And so this is what it looks like to be embodied in our time. And I think also the church has a significant opportunity to dig into these kind of, to literally dig into some of these trash bins and things like that. And, what does your community need in the way of thrifting or reusing? One of the things I really like to talk about is, if you guys ever meander closer to downtown Nashville, there's this nonprofit called Turnip Green. It's really great. And basically they take donations from all the things that places like Goodwill won't take, which is a lot of stuff. But people will still find purposes for these things, like old signs or just knickknacks and crafts, you name it. And they pretty much take it. And people go there, and everything's just donation based, so on the back end. So you just tell them what you want to pay for it. And so on one end you get these donations like of stuff, and on the back end people are shopping there and just sort of paying whatever they want. And it's just this cool like nonprofit that exists called Turnip Green. That's a great model for the church. That's a whole ministry right there. You got some space, start you a little Turnip Green. Another thing that's really happening, and then I'll turn it back over, that I think is really neat. They're called like repair cafes. And so these are like people who are just opening their garage doors once a week, setting up some tables, and sort of offering like if you're handy with anything, just offering a place to sew something up or repair something or fix something, and so people in the community will bring their coffee makers that are broken, or their sweaters, or their sheets that need sewn up. And so that becomes kind of a ministry in a neighborhood. And then the other thing is there's kind of a discipleship element where youth can learn these skills from people maybe in our congregations who kind of are a little handy, but are ready to pay that onward. So there's a lot of cool creative ideas, I think, to sort of push back against that planned obsolescence thing that exists so much. But
yeah, it's a shame Greg Seplow isn't here tonight, because he could tell us a lot about that kind of stuff. He likes to repair things, doesn't he? He says, don't throw that away, don't get rid of that. I'm pretty sure I can fix it. And I think something we need to think about, especially as you mentioned right to repair. I work in technology, and that's a huge issue in technology, because companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google do things purposely to make it hard for us to repair things. Just an example, I have a CPAP machine, and it's 3 years old, and the motor started making this awful noise. So I looked at what it would take to get fixed, and it was a lot of money. You had to send it to the company, or you had to buy a new one. And to buy a new one, you have to go to the doctor again, get a new prescription. So I found where you could buy motors, did a lot of studying on what to do, took it apart, put a new motor in, didn't work. It worked, sort of, but it didn't do all the smart stuff it was supposed to do. Until I opened it back up and I unplugged the modem that called home to the manufacturer. And then I powered it back on, turned it on, and guess what? It works perfectly. Exactly like I expected it to work. So that tells you that there are ways that these companies do things to try to force us to buy new stuff instead of repairing it. Now, obviously, some things get completely worn out eventually, and there are issues with electronics and recycling. But I think if we can repair things, and if we have that right, because the government says companies have to let us do it, and believe me, they're dragged kicking and screaming. Apple doesn't like you to open their stuff up. They tell you it's too nice, it's designed a certain way, but you can do it. But then, they'll tell you if it breaks, it's on you. But I think that is one thing I think we need to look at, and definitely all these different nonprofits. And there's something you mentioned in the book, and I can attest, I worked at Goodwill for about 5 years, and even Goodwill can't absorb all the stuff that they get. In fact, when the economy was down, Goodwills were actually making a lot of money shipping scrap clothing overseas, selling it for a certain amount, and that was big business until the dollar got strong again, and then that kind of collapsed. But I mean, at one time there were just there can be warehouses just of old clothing because either people don't buy it or there's just so much of it. So I think we need to be cautious sometimes, even when we're donating, and find those places that can actually absorb it. And if somebody tells you we can't take something, go find somebody that can, because like you said, there are places that can take things that people at Goodwill can't take for whatever reason.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, tons of our stuff, when you donate it, it doesn't find a home. It ends up in the landfill, and often it ends up in someone else's landfill on the other side of the ocean somehow, because that's the world we live in, which is just wild. Yeah, I think that's a huge consideration. Which if you peel that other layer down, which is really, what does it mean to live more simplistic lives? And and I think that's a question I'm super interested in, and I think as the church, that's a question that we should all be more interested in. And I think that the river that we swim in here where we live in America, right? It's a very consumeristic flow, and it runs very strong. And sometimes I think it feels like swimming upstream to even care about any of these things. And sometimes it may be swimming upstream, right? You build some muscles over time. But I think that there are some questions underneath that question there to think about. What do I really need? What of all of this stuff is actually increasing my well-being or the well-being of those around me or my community, right, or my kids' lives, or any of this. And so, or just thinking about how much have I shopped this week, or what have I bought this week, and just asking more specific questions about those things, because we're kind of in trouble, I would say, globally around our rate of consumption. And so I think the church has a phenomenal opportunity to stand up and proclaim a different kind of lifestyle and a different kind of way of living that looks much more simplistic, much more joyful, much more full of life, much more life-giving. But that's it's not sexy, and it doesn't sell anything, and so it's the downward mobility, I'm going to say, of what it looks like to carry your cross in the way that we steward our resources, in the way that we live, in the way that we use our money, in the way that we use our time and all of our resources. And yeah, I think there's so many questions there for us to think about. But
Yeah, and just as an aside, a good resource if you're wanting to see where theology and economics kind of intersect, there's a great professor here at Vanderbilt named Jorg Rieger. He's Methodist, so he's Wesleyan within us, and he deals with how economics and the way we approach these things of consuming and other things impact our theology, and how our theology can maybe reshape some stuff. And he's got some fascinating stuff. It's very challenging, I'll tell you that, because he has some very, very, very big ideas on how to change some stuff. But I think what can we do, I guess, as people, especially the daunting idea of maybe even lifestyle changes or things, what are some simple things that we could possibly do, just starting small in ways that we can better care for our creation?
yeah, that's sort of the irony. That's sort of the irony of it all, is that all the things that we can do are small things, but that each one of those small things matters a whole lot. And I talk about that a lot in the way of, all the environmental degradation that's going on today around the world, and it just feels so big, and it just feels like, man, what, how could my life possibly matter, and my choices possibly matter with it all? Because, but that's sort of the irony of it all, is that when you see the numbers, and you see how one of these little choices over here becomes a fall of dominoes and kind of a butterfly effect, because that's how creation works. Everything is so much more interconnected than we think. And I've seen studies where they estimate that just basically 1 cubic meter of pollution affects around 30,000 people, and so that's like 1 cubic meter is like if you took if you took one gram per cubic meter. I'm sorry, this is like, Anyway, all that to say is, so if you took like a teaspoon of sugar and dissolved it in a big tub that was the size of both your washer and dryer put together, that would be like what that is, right? And so that much pollution in our air affecting around 30,000 people, right? How do we quantify that? Well, what that tells us is that actually what little bit we do every time we carpool, every time we reduce our usage, right? All of these things affect what we would talk about our footprint. We all have a footprint, an environmental footprint, and how much are we using of any given thing, depending on the lights we've left on in our house, right? Our HVAC settings, all of these little things, all these choices around plastic, right? And reducing trips, all of these things actually have great ramifications in the world. And I think it's really cool to think about the church leading the way in a lot of these spaces. But yeah, there's so many things. We just had a clothesline and hung our laundry for years and years and years, because your dryers is one of the biggest energy consumers. And by the way, almost every one of these things that you can do to help the earth, which in turn helps our neighbors, right, saves you money. almost every time. I think a lot of times we think, well, if we're shopping organic and driving a Tesla or whatever, we're gonna. But that's like really most of it's about reducing our footprint, reducing our consumption, and that's going to save us a lot of money. And even for a church building, right, there are so many different ways to consider taking care of the earth and then saving that money and saving those resources and then using it for missions or something else, right? And so I think once we begin reframing a lot of these things, it just makes a lot of sense. But I would say reducing is huge. I actually, ironically, don't talk about recycling as much because I think recycling is a bit of a scapegoat. I don't think it's any surprise to say that our recycling system here in America is pretty broken. I mean, in Nashville, we can pretty much recycle plastic bottles, and a couple other plastic things, and that's like it. And then if anything that's not one of those two numbers gets put in that recycling bin, and so if you're a really great recycler, but your neighbor isn't, they go to the same place, and when that gets baled together, when they bale that recycling together, and they see how contaminated it is, then the whole thing is shot, and so they're not going to get a buyer for that. And so recycling is a Band-Aid at best. If you can do it, right? Recycle, do it, but it's not a real solution. And so I think we've got to think more about. I like to talk about in church spaces, right? Think about dishes, like really radical stuff, like actual dishes. We used to eat together every week before COVID at our local church, and I know most church buildings or most people, they try to use the single-use products, and for a lot of reasons, because maybe someone remembers back in 1985, we had a lot of potlucks, and there were these two sweet old people who got stuck with all the dishes afterward. And at some point, someone said, "Forget this, we're using paper," And that's sort of that narrative. Maybe no one's even around for that anymore. But I know in our church, like we try to change that narrative to say, this is an extension of what we believe, and it's part of our worship. And so not only we would eat together, we would wash dishes together afterward, and we'd have 3 bins, and like you do, and there's about 6 of us around the table. Somebody's playing guitar over here, and then it's a part of what it means to be community together. And so I think there's helpful ways for us to frame our relationship with these little changes that actually add up to a lot and can be life-giving. And those are all contextual, and you have to figure out what works and what doesn't work. But I think that there's so many little changes that we can make in the way of our relationship with creation that is beautiful, is life-giving, can save money, and so there's just so many different ways. But I will say, back to the single-use thing, anytime we can avoid any single-use product, it is huge, especially plastic, right? We know that plastic does not ever break down. You'll see some things that say your toothbrush will only last this many years. Well, it's just saying that's how many years until that toothbrush that you threw away, that plastic toothbrush, becomes what we call nurdles, which are like microscopic pieces of plastic. So it actually never goes away. It just becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so now they say that there's probably not any spot in our oceans left that doesn't have plastic in it. And they came out with a study a couple years ago that says that you and I have at least right now, a credit card's worth of plastic inside of our bodies in this room right now. And once you begin to see these things, you're like, man, I don't think God intended any of this, and I don't think God really loves any of this. And I think, as God's people, that we should be against those kinds of things as much as we can. And so a lot of this is just, we haven't talked about this kind of thing in the church a lot, and so it feels kind of abrupt. But honestly, that's one of the things, back to your original question, that I love about our roots of the Church of the Nazarene, is that we started out of a movement of justice, right, on the streets of LA, taking care of our neighbors and taking radical stands against certain ways of living, right, and stands against things that bodily harmed people and harmed communities. And that's no different than what we're talking about here when it comes to, these different forms of waste that are radically changing God's creation and radically harming our neighbors. And so yeah, there's I could go on and on, but I'll stop. But yeah.
Well, that's good. You talked a bit about creation, and you went back to saying, at the beginning, and we're thinking garden there, where we're put here to care for creation. Often we hear dominion, which I think is a poor translation, because it's more of a caring, of a being in creation and caring for it. That was our original purpose that we're still trying to recapture. But extending on from that, you talk a bit about the idea of what God does in creation. And I know last week we talked a bit about the difference between old and new creation. And I think part of what you mentioned is that this is your quote, which I really liked. I highlighted this one, was, "Our God has always been more interested in salvaging creation rather than discarding and upgrading." And so I think there's a deep theological thing there about how we view what God is doing in the world and what God will do, and even our eschatological, so our thinking about what happens at the end, is more about God remaking and not really upgrading or discarding, not getting rid of, but of that salvaging what's here into a better version of itself.
Yeah.
If you can go into that a little bit.
I think I really appreciate you brought that up, because I think if we're honest in the church, one of the things that sort of gets in our way, I think there's two main things, right? We'll just name them, that can often get in our way from caring for creation as God's people. One is that it gets mixed up in politics, doesn't it? Right? That it's this wing or that wing or whatever, right? When there's no wings involved at all, right? It's just about what it means to be the people of God, to care for creation. That this is not a political statement. This is I can't open up my Bible, read it, and get any other conclusion. And that this is God's, and we're here to take care of it. But on the other side, I do think that there is a toxic eschatology factor. And what I mean by that is that there's no shortage of Christian cultural narratives that tell us that we shouldn't care for creation because it's all going to burn anyway, or who cares, or whatever, right? That Jesus is coming back soon. Which, it has so much irony there, because if I think Jesus is coming back really soon, then I'm going to do my darndest to take the best care of creation and love my neighbor, right, with everything that I can right now. And even if Jesus is returning tomorrow, that's not going to change, right, what we believe our gospel message is, which is to love our neighbor and embody that, right, despite what we believe is going to happen at the end times. And so, there are so many great threads through Scripture about that, and I love that scene in Revelation, right, where God is continually inbreaking in creation and inbreaking coming toward us. God is setting up that new kingdom here on earth, right? Heaven on earth. Heaven's coming near. Jesus would say it over and over and over again. The kingdom of heaven is coming near. And that's what we believe eventually happens right at the end, is that God comes here, and God doesn't make all new things, but God comes and makes all things new. And there's a big difference there. And in the Hebrew and some of the prophets, when they talk about the renew and the covenant renew, this is this Hebrew word. I can see it in my head. I think it's hadas. It's the same word for new moon, right? And so we don't actually get a new moon every 28 days. You get the same moon, and it comes back around again, right? It's this sort of idea, right? It's different than like God's going to create all this and then throw it all away and then do something else, right? But no, our God is a God of redeeming and recycling and resurrecting, or as the Apostle Paul says, the reconciliation of all things, right? Colossians 1:20, and that through the blood of Jesus Christ is what it says. and right and that we get to be participants in that reconciliation of all things. All things. What's all things? Is that like my socks? Like I don't know, but like it's all things on us, right? And so that's exciting. That for me is exciting to consider and to think about. Yeah, there's so much there. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I kind of went on a tangent there.
No, I think you did. Yeah, you brought it home there on that. Are there any questions
Yeah,
so far?
Let's chat. Love to hear what you guys think, or maybe what you're struggling with. Any of this? Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And I thought of this earlier and it slipped out of my head, but I think what's underneath this as well is that we've got to get a little bit better at asking questions or getting more curious. And I think that's an aspect to what it means to live holy lives, is to be curious, right? Where did this product come from? How was it made? Who was it made by? And then inadvertently, who was harmed through its making, right? Who was harmed in the purchase of this, right? And that there, not too long ago in history, these were questions that we didn't have to ask. And so you shouldn't feel ashamed or whatever that maybe you haven't asked these questions before, because a lot of us, the world has changed a lot, but today, we can actually trace these products back to certain ethical practices, right? This is certain, all sorts of things. And so I think getting more curious about where a product is born, I'm going to say, and then where a product goes to die, right? The beginning of the life of something and then the end of the life of something. Right? I think that those are really great conversations to have in the church and to have in the world. But yeah, that made me think there's so many good products. I'll give a quick plug for a company called Grove Collaborative. It's where my wife and I buy all of our household products for years and years. And so, maybe this is a taboo thing to say, but transition to bamboo toilet paper. It's one of the easiest things. Like, let's not cut down trees for our toilet paper, and that's, that seems funny, and maybe that's like, well, I really love Charmin's, but, that's kind of like, these are the kind of changes that can begin to actually make a really big difference. Bamboo is like amazing. Bamboo draws down more carbon quicker than trees does, and then you cut it to the ground and it's back in like a year. It is invasive, so maybe don't plant it in your backyard, but it's just like these sort of like small changes that really make a difference in our consumption, in those little household products and things like that can be really huge. Yeah. What else?
And did you have a question? Okay, I thought you saw your hand going up. That's okay. Speaking of where things come from and knowing the story of the things we're purchasing, something you highlight in the book is that globally, a lot of the reasons that the things that we purchase become cheaper is because there is an element of slavery involved. And so kind of discuss how we might try to do better research to find out, are some of these products harming others through that? Is that why they're so cheap?
Yeah, absolutely. Clothes are obviously a big one, right? We know that sweatshops are a real thing, and when you see a shirt that brand new shirt only costs $6, that's a problem. That's a problem. because that almost immediately flags that there's some sinister things going on there with that company or with, and so these are things that it's hard to historically, right, when we see a good deal, like, you think like, man, that's a win, right? It was only $6. Awesome, but I think there's another question there to say, like, wait, what happened here? That this was only $6, and our electronics are a big part of that as well. Cobalt and things like that are in every phone that we have, electronic that we have. These are full of minerals that I can almost guarantee you, that people were harmed or people are enslaved in a lot of places, especially in the Congo, to get these minerals. Which on the backside, talking about recycling, that's another reason why it's really important to recycle your electronics. If you've got a drawer full of old phones or laptops or televisions or whatever, that needs to go in electronic recycling. And there's actually quite a few drops for places like things like that out there, Best Buy, Target, Publix, and random places like that, or just private companies as well. But and things like that, we don't want to talk about it, but things like shrimp are often very, there's a lot of conflict around fish and just a lot of things that, that we like to consume may in fact have a lot of consequences around the world. And so there's actually some really great, there's lots of information. There's more information out there about these kinds of things than ever before. There's you can go to End Slavery, which is a website. Also, another one I'll talk about is Better World Shopper, and they actually have an app that you can get on your phone, and they're probably not the only ones now, that gives a rating, A, B, C, D, all the way to F, right? So you can look up, see this product that you want to buy, and it'll give you kind of an ethical rating of, like, is this a good product to support? Is this a good company to support, And I think, once you've kind of done your homework, right, you're usually not even shopping for the same stuff. You kind of just figure out what are the products you like, right, and you just kind of keep buying that thing. But, there's a lot of things like that. One last one I'll mention that we don't talk about enough is palm oil. If you were to stop at a gas station right now and buy a snack, it would probably, whether that's a Snickers bar or a Takis or something my daughter loves, it probably has palm oil in it. And unless it's got some certification on there, which almost it never does, that's tons of deforestation's happening right now for palm oil. And so they are just clear cutting forests and rainforests to plant palm oil trees and harvest that so that we can have it for all of our snacks and things. And that's a huge one to create a little more awareness on. There are some places that are doing it right, but for the most part, that's one to look out for. But and it is about just being more curious about our purchases, and it's not something to be just overwhelmed about that, I can't buy anything now, but it's like, how can I become a little more curious about these products and dig a little deeper, right, as people who believe that this matters.
Yeah. And I would say, if you've ever watched like an Apple product announcement, when they do talk about these new things they want you to purchase, they'll go into a lot about how much of their products are recycled materials. And that's not just marketing puffery. So they're trying to tell you something. Some of it might be a virtue signal from that company trying to say, well, look, we're using this. But when they talk about that, they are trying to make some strides, I'd say. Not necessarily that it's all good. For one thing, it's cheaper for them, and they're able to get out of certain markets. But But those are things kind of to watch for, because it sounds like a lot of flashy, they're making this, talking about what they're using recycled, or how much of the phone or the iPad or the computer is recycled. But there's a reason they're telling you that, and part of it is because they're trying to be made ready for laws and legal action that might come, but also to kind of let you know that, well, don't feel too bad about replacing that one you've had for 10 years, as long as you recycle it. And that's also why most of these companies offer, if you try to trade it in and there's no value, but they'll say, hey, but we'll take it for free. There's a reason for that. They're going to recycle it. So do take advantage of those things. That's a simple way. Like, if you have an old Apple product, just go to it and they'll say, here's a place to recycle it. They'll give you that. Microsoft, Google do that as well. But those are just things to think about, of how we can repurpose things as well, I would say, because, there are ways to help. Any other questions? Libby has one.
Yeah, I don't know if I heard the first part of that. Was that you're just kind of addressing the conflict there with all the cheap goods that are coming in? Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it is to, like, your first question is kind of, can I just refuse this? Do I need this? And I'm going to speak as a parent of two little girls. It's harder than ever our kids just come home with things. Like, they come home from school and people have just given them, I'm going to just be blunt, they've given them crap. They're just coming home with crap. And, and often it's just like, it is kind of what you say, like just sort of made in China, just plastic tinkered things. And we have to be so vigilant, even in our little household, to sort of keep at bay all of the junk, because it also does something in your spirit, I think, when you're just surrounded by stuff as well, which is a whole nother conversation. But I think we have to actively work toward that. And I think anytime you can, if you're going to buy something, and you have that choice between that cheaper thing or that more expensive thing that has that warranty or that is hopefully a better product, or from the Amish, it's like, I sold, in my early 20s, I got sucked into this situation where I was selling cutlery like you do. And but it was really great cutlery and very expensive. And the whole sale was like, you could either spend a whole bunch of money over the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years replacing these knives, or you could buy this one set right now forever, And ironically, all these years later, it's a helpful metaphor to think about all of this, is that for those who can do it, I think it's important to get those better ones, and then on the other side, to advocate for better products anywhere that we can, But yeah, it's a bigger problem more than ever today, with all the small little plastic, just the junk that is just everywhere. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've kind of reached the end. What I'm going to ask you to do before we close in prayer is, could you write down a number between 1 and 50? And what we're going to do is going to have everybody say a number. Now, if you say the number, you win it right then. But if you're close to it, we'll we'll try to remember. So you'll need to pay attention to what. So if you want to win the book, I'm going to start on this side. Yes.
Okay.
1, 27, 13, Pastor Dwayne, 14, 33, 42, Joyce.
Okay, well, Pastor, it was 15. Nailed it.
So,
That's awesome.
Pastor
We're
Dwayne
riding
wins the
wave,
book
dude.
tonight,
We're riding
so.
the wave. That's awesome. Right on.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know what you have, but
No.
I'm just so thankful to get to sit down with you guys and talk about any of this. And I've got some stickers and other things back there, and I hope that you guys just feel free to holler at me anytime.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming out. We are going to ask you to please, if you're willing to close us in prayer tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. So let's pray. Lord of all creation, God, we give you thanks that we are a people who are created in your image to serve and keep this place in this garden that we call home. Lord, may not be easy at all times. It may not be simple at all times. But I pray, God, that you would give us the spirit of love that would drive us toward asking better questions and engaging in more loving and holy right relatedness with your creation as we live here on this earth in Nashville and Hendersonville, and as we work to see the reconciliation of all things. In your name.